They say the badge is supposed to protect and serve, but what happens when those sworn to uphold justice become the very monsters they're meant to stop? The case of Stephanie Lazarus begins like a crime novel that no one could have imagined. In the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Van Nuys, California, where palm trees lined pristine streets and families felt safe behind their manicured lawns, a brutal murder would expose one of the most shocking betrayals in law enforcement history. February 24, 1986. Started as an ordinary Monday morning, but by evening, it would become the day that changed everything for the Rasmuson family and revealed how far a jealous heart could fall. Sher Rasmuson was living her dream. At 29, she was a successful nursing director at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, recently married to her college sweetheart John Rutan, and settling into their new life together in their Van Nuys condominium. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered with an infectious smile and a compassionate heart that drew people to her. Friends described her as genuinely kind, the type of woman who would drop everything to help a colleague or spend her weekends volunteering at community health fairs. But someone was watching Sherry's happiness with growing resentment, someone who believed that John Rutan belonged to her and her alone. That someone was LAPD officer Stephanie Lazarus, a woman who had transformed her unrequited love into a dangerous obsession that would culminate in cold-blooded murder. Stephanie Lazarus was everything you'd expect from a decorated police officer. She was intelligent, athletic, and ambitious, rising through the ranks of the Los Angeles Police Department with impressive efficiency. She had joined the force in 1983, just 3 years before the murder, and had quickly established herself as a competent and reliable officer. To her colleagues, she appeared to be the epitome of professionalism, someone who understood the weight of the badge and the responsibility that came with it. But beneath that professional exterior lurked a woman consumed by jealousy and rage. Lazarus had dated John Rutan during their college years at UCLA, and while he had moved on, she never did. Even after their relationship ended, even after John made it clear he wasn't interested in rekindling their romance, Stephanie Lazarus refused to let go. She continued to pursue him relentlessly, showing up at his workplace unannounced, calling him repeatedly, and making it abundantly clear that she considered him to be hers. When John married Sherry in November 1985, something inside Stephanie Lazarus snapped. The woman who had sworn to protect and serve was about to become a calculating killer, using her training and access as a police officer to plan and execute a murder that would remain unsolved for over 2 decades. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Lazarus's behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. She confronted Sherry directly, approaching her at the hospital where she worked and making it clear that she viewed her as an obstacle to be removed. Witnesses later recalled seeing a tall, athletic blonde woman who matched Lazarus's description engaging in heated conversations with Sherry, conversations that left the young bride visibly shaken and concerned for her safety. Sherry confided in friends and family about these encounters, expressing genuine fear about this woman who seemed determined to destroy her marriage. She told her mother about the confrontations, describing how this police officer had made it clear that she considered John to be off-limits to other women. But in 1986, stalking laws were virtually non-existent, and the idea that a police officer could pose a threat seemed almost impossible to comprehend. On that fateful Monday morning, John Rutan kissed his wife goodbye and left for work, just as he had done countless times before. Sherry was staying home that day, planning to do some cleaning and run errands around their condominium complex. It was a decision that would cost her everything. What happened next was reconstructed years later through forensic evidence and the meticulous work of detectives who refused to let the case die. Sometime during the late morning hours, Stephanie Lazarus arrived at the Rutan condominium. She came prepared for violence, carrying her service weapon and wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. This was premeditated murder, planned and executed by someone who understood exactly how to cover her tracks. The confrontation between the two women was brutal and terrifying. Evidence at the scene showed signs of a fierce struggle, with furniture overturned and personal items scattered throughout the living room. Sherry fought for her life with everything she had, managing to bite her attacker hard enough to leave DNA evidence that would eventually solve the case. But she was no match for a trained police officer who had come prepared to kill. Lazarus struck Sherry repeatedly in the head with a ceramic vase, beating her with such force that the weapon shattered into pieces. But the beating wasn't enough. Determined to ensure that Sherry would never again stand between her and John, Lazarus pulled out her .38 caliber service revolver. She used a pillow as a makeshift silencer, a technique she had learned during her police training, and shot Sherry 3 times in the chest at close range. The sound of gunshots, even muffled by the pillow, would have echoed through the condominium complex. But Lazarus was prepared for that too. She quickly began staging the scene to make it appear as though Sherry had been the victim of a botched burglary. She ransacked the apartment, overturning drawers and scattering belongings to create the impression that someone had been searching for valuables. She took some electronics and jewelry to make the robbery appear authentic, items that she would later dispose of to eliminate evidence. But Stephanie Lazarus made one crucial mistake in her otherwise carefully planned murder. In her haste to stage the scene and escape before being discovered, she failed to account for the bite mark on her arm where Sherry had fought back. That single act of desperation by the victim would eventually become the key that unlocked the entire case, though it would take more than 20 years for technology to catch up with justice. When John Retton returned home that evening, he walked into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found his wife's body in their living room, surrounded by the chaos of what appeared to be a violent robbery. The woman he loved, the person he had planned to spend his life with, had been beaten and shot to death in their own home while he was at work, unable to protect her. The initial investigation by the LAPD was both thorough and completely misdirected. Detectives arrived at the scene and saw exactly what Stephanie Lazarus had intended them to see: a home invasion gone wrong. A young woman who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when criminals broke into her home looking for easy money. The staging was convincing enough that it fit the pattern of other burglaries in the area, and investigators had no reason to suspect that one of their own colleagues could be responsible. But there were problems with the burglary theory from the very beginning. Problems that should have raised red flags for experienced detectives. The items taken from the home were relatively insignificant, while more valuable electronics and jewelry were left behind untouched. The level of violence used against Sherry seemed excessive for a simple robbery, suggesting a personal motive rather than a random crime. Most importantly, there were no signs of forced entry, indicating that Sherry had likely opened the door for someone she knew or trusted. John Retton tried desperately to direct investigators towards Stephanie Lazarus. He told them about her obsessive behavior, her refusal to accept that their relationship was over, and her recent confrontations with Sherry. He explained that his wife had been genuinely frightened of this woman, that she had expressed concern about what the officer might do. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The LAPD detectives working the case seemed reluctant to seriously consider that one of their own could be responsible for such a heinous crime. They interviewed Lazarus as a matter of routine, but it was clear that she was being treated as a witness rather than a suspect. She provided alibis for her whereabouts during the time of the murder, alibis that were accepted without thorough verification. She expressed appropriate shock and sadness about Sherry's death, playing the role of a concerned former girlfriend who was devastated by the tragedy. What the investigators didn't know was that Stephanie Lazarus had been preparing for this moment since the day she decided to commit murder. As a police officer, she understood how investigations worked, what evidence detectives would look for, and how to provide answers that would deflect suspicion. She had crafted her story carefully, ensuring that every detail would paint her as an innocent bystander rather than a cold-blooded killer. The case quickly went cold. Without any solid leads or evidence pointing to a specific suspect, detectives moved on to other investigations, leaving the Rasmussen family to grieve without answers or justice. For John Retton, the loss was devastating beyond measure. Not only had he lost his wife in the most violent way imaginable, but he was forced to live with the knowledge that her killer was still out there, possibly planning to strike again. Years passed, then decades, and still the case remained unsolved. Stephanie Lazarus continued her career with the LAPD, eventually becoming a detective herself and working in the art theft division. She married, had children, and built a life that appeared normal and successful on the surface. To anyone looking at her career trajectory, she seemed like a model police officer who had dedicated her life to serving the public and fighting crime. But inside, she was living with the knowledge that she had committed the ultimate betrayal of her oath and her badge. Every day she went to work, she was surrounded by colleagues who trusted her, who believed in her integrity, who had no idea that they were working alongside a murderer. She participated in investigations, gave testimony in court, and upheld the law while knowing that she had violated it in the most fundamental way possible. The breakthrough that would finally bring justice for Sher Rasmuson came in 2009, more than 23 years after the murder. Cold case detectives were reviewing old files, looking for cases that might benefit from advances in DNA technology. When they reopened the Rasmussen file, they discovered something that had been overlooked for decades: the saliva sample from the bite mark on the killer's arm that Sherry had managed to inflict during her final moments. DNA technology had evolved dramatically since 1986, and what had once been impossible was now routine. The sample that had sat in evidence storage for over 2 decades suddenly held the key to solving one of the LAPD's most baffling cold cases. When forensic scientists extracted a full DNA profile from that saliva sample, they entered it into the national database, hoping against hope that the killer's genetic fingerprint would finally reveal their identity. The hit came back almost immediately. The DNA belonged to LAPD Detective Stephanie Lazarus. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Here was a decorated officer, someone who had spent decades investigating crimes and putting criminals behind bars. And she was the very monster they had been hunting all along. The woman who had sworn to protect and serve had used her training, her access, and her knowledge of police procedures to commit the perfect murder and cover her tracks for over 20 years. But the perfect murder had one fatal flaw, and that flaw was about to destroy everything Stephanie Lazarus had built since that February morning in 1986. Detectives faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you investigate one of your own without tipping them off? How do you gather evidence against someone who understands exactly how investigations work and knows all the tricks that criminals use to avoid detection? The answer required a level of deception and careful planning that matched Lazarus's own cunning. They began by covertly obtaining a fresh DNA sample from Lazarus to confirm the match. Undercover officers followed her to a Costco store where they watched her purchase food and drinks. When she discarded a cup and straw in a trash can, they quietly retrieved it and sent it to the lab for analysis. The results were conclusive. The DNA from the cup matched the DNA from the bite mark perfectly. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, detectives prepared to make their arrest. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was called into what she believed was a routine meeting about an old art theft case. She walked into the interview room with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, someone who had successfully kept her deadly secret for 23 years. What followed was one of the most chilling interrogations in criminal history. As detectives gradually revealed what they knew, Lazarus's demeanor shifted from confident professionalism to nervous deflection to outright panic. She tried every trick in the book, claiming she couldn't remember details from so long ago, suggesting that the DNA evidence must be contaminated, and insisting that she had never been to the Rutan home. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her lies began to unravel with each passing minute. When confronted with the DNA match, she claimed it must have been from a previous encounter with Sherry at the hospital. When shown crime scene photos, she feigned ignorance and shock. When pressed about her relationship with John Rueton, she minimized their history and denied any ongoing feelings for him. The most disturbing aspect of the interrogation was watching a trained police officer use every technique she had learned to deflect suspicion from herself. She employed the same strategies she had probably used countless times to break down suspects in her own cases. But now she was on the receiving end, and her desperation was palpable. As the interview progressed, Lazarus's composure completely crumbled. The woman who had maintained her secret for over 2 decades was finally facing the consequences of her actions. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, bringing an end to one of the longest-running cold cases in LAPD history. The trial that followed was a media sensation, drawing national attention to the unprecedented case of a police officer who had literally gotten away with murder for over 20 years. Prosecutors painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealous rage, someone who had used her position and training to commit the ultimate betrayal of public trust. The evidence against Lazarus was overwhelming. The DNA match was scientifically irrefutable, placing her at the scene of the crime in the most intimate way possible. Witnesses testified about her obsessive behavior toward John Rueton and her threatening encounters with Sherry. The staged crime scene showed all the hallmarks of someone with inside knowledge of police procedures. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Lazarus's own behavior during and after the investigation. Phone records showed that she had called John Rueton shortly after the murder, ostensibly to offer condolences but actually to gauge what he might know about her involvement. She had attended Sherry's funeral, playing the role of a concerned friend while knowing she was the one responsible for the tragedy. Most chilling of all was the realization that Lazarus had spent decades working cases involving violence against women, all while knowing she had committed the ultimate act of violence against an innocent woman whose only crime was marrying the man Lazarus believed belonged to her. The defense tried desperately to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the DNA evidence could have been transferred through some other means, that the investigation had been tainted by the passage of time, and that there was no direct evidence placing Lazarus at the scene at the time of the murder. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of scientific evidence and witness testimony. On March 8, 2012, the jury delivered their verdict after just 1 day of deliberation. Guilty of first-degree murder. Stephanie Lazarus, the decorated LAPD detective, was finally being held accountable for the brutal killing she had committed 26 years earlier. At her sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing condemnation of Lazarus's actions and their impact on public trust in law enforcement. He sentenced her to 27 years to life in prison, ensuring that she would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars for her crimes. But the Stephanie Lazarus case was just the beginning of a much darker story about corruption and violence within the ranks of those sworn to protect and serve. As shocking as her crimes were, they would pale in comparison to the systematic abuse and cover-ups that were about to be exposed in police departments across the country. In Laverne, Tennessee, a small suburban community outside Nashville, residents believed they could trust their local police force to maintain order and protect their families. The 60-person department seemed like the kind of close-knit law enforcement agency where officers knew each other's families and worked together to serve their community with integrity and professionalism. But behind the badges and uniforms, a culture of sexual misconduct and abuse was flourishing, protected by a code of silence that would ultimately destroy careers and shatter public trust in ways that seemed impossible to repair. The scandal centered around Officer Megan Hall, a young woman who had joined the force with what appeared to be genuine intentions to serve her community. But instead of finding mentorship and professional development, she became entangled in a web of sexual exploitation that involved multiple male colleagues and supervisors, creating a toxic environment that turned the police station into a playground for predators in uniform. The details that emerged during the investigation were more disturbing than anything found in the most salacious crime novels. Officers were engaging in sexual activities while on duty, using the police station itself as their personal brothel. They were sharing explicit photographs with each other, treating female colleagues as objects for their entertainment rather than as professional partners. The culture of abuse extended far beyond simple misconduct. It involved supervisors who not only failed to stop the behavior, but actively encouraged it, creating an environment where sexual exploitation was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Officers were having sex in patrol cars, in the station house, and at off-duty parties that resembled scenes from the most debauched college fraternity rather than gatherings of law enforcement professionals. What made the situation even more disturbing was the systematic nature of the abuse. This wasn't a case of isolated incidents or individual bad actors. It was an entire culture that had rotted from the inside out, where the very people entrusted with protecting women and families were preying on their colleagues and potentially on the citizens they served. The investigation revealed that Police Chief Burrell Davis not only knew about the misconduct, but was actively participating in it. He was soliciting pornographic images from Officer Hall and encouraging the sexual exploitation that was destroying his department from within. The man responsible for maintaining professional standards and protecting his officers was instead leading the charge in their victimization. When the scandal finally broke, the fallout was swift and devastating. 6 officers were fired, including Chief Davis, while 3 others were suspended without pay. The tiny department was left in shambles, its reputation destroyed, and its ability to serve the community severely compromised. But the most tragic aspect of the Laverne scandal was how it illustrated the vulnerability of women in law enforcement. Officer Megan Hall later filed a federal lawsuit alleging that she had been groomed and sexually exploited under the guise of mentorship and training. She claimed that what others saw as willing participation was actually a systematic campaign of manipulation and abuse by male colleagues who held power over her career and safety. The lawsuit painted a picture of a young woman who had entered law enforcement with hopes of making a difference, only to find herself trapped in a system that viewed her as a sexual commodity rather than a professional equal. The men who should have been protecting and mentoring her were instead using their positions of authority to exploit and abuse her. The city of Laverne eventually settled Hall's lawsuit for $500,000, a tacit admission that the department had failed in its most basic duty to protect its own officers from predatory behavior. But no amount of money could undo the damage that had been done, both to the individuals involved and to the community's trust in their police force. The Laverne scandal was part of a much larger pattern of sexual misconduct and abuse within law enforcement agencies across the country. A comprehensive review by NBC News found more than 60 lawsuits costing taxpayers over $40 million, all involving disturbing accounts of sexual misconduct against female police officers in major city departments. The stories were horrifyingly similar across different cities and departments. Female officers in Chicago reported being forced to perform oral sex on supervisors inside patrol cars. Officers in Philadelphia described being groped and sexually harassed by sergeants and commanders. Women in New York told of having their intimate photos stolen and shared among male colleagues. These weren't isolated incidents or cases of miscommunication. They were systematic patterns of abuse that revealed a culture within law enforcement that treated women as second-class citizens, unworthy of the basic respect and protection that should be afforded to all officers. What made these cases even more disturbing was the retaliation that female officers faced when they tried to report the abuse. Many found themselves transferred to punishment posts, isolated from their colleagues, and subjected to further harassment designed to silence their complaints. Others discovered that their allegations were never properly investigated or documented, disappearing into a bureaucratic black hole designed to protect perpetrators rather than victims. The message was clear. Women who dared to speak out against sexual misconduct would face consequences that could destroy their careers and their lives. It was a system designed to maintain the status quo, where predators in uniform could continue their abuse with impunity while their victims suffered in silence. The scope of police sexual violence extends far beyond individual departments or isolated incidents. Research conducted by the Invisible Institute and ProPublica revealed a disturbing pattern across the Chicago Police Department, where over 300 complaints of sexual assault and misconduct were systematically downplayed or ignored, enabling officers to become repeat offenders who preyed on colleagues and citizens alike. The case of Officer Eric Tabb exemplifies how this culture of protection and silence allows predators to flourish within law enforcement. By the time Internal Affairs cleared Tabb of one sexual assault complaint, he had allegedly assaulted 3 other women from his police academy class. The pattern was as predictable as it was horrifying. A complaint would be filed, the investigation would be perfunctory at best, and the officer would be cleared to continue his predatory behavior. Alexis Bird-Maxey was in her 2nd month at the Chicago Police Academy when she experienced firsthand how the system failed to protect even its newest members. On March 17, 2023, she felt fellow recruit Eric Tabb's hands on her waist and his body pressed against her as he walked behind her in the academy hallway. The contact was unmistakably sexual, deliberate, and degrading. When she confronted him immediately, hoping to see some sign of remorse or acknowledgement that his behavior was inappropriate, she instead saw him smirk. That smirk told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he took her objections and how confident he was that there would be no consequences for his actions. The next day, Bird-Maxey filed a sexual misconduct complaint, beginning what would become a lengthy battle against a system designed to protect her attacker rather than deliver justice. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of behavior that should have been stopped years earlier. Tabb faced multiple charges, including aggravated criminal sexual abuse, but his ability to continue preying on women for so long exposed the fundamental failures of the police department's oversight and accountability systems. Experts who study police misconduct note that such behavior is often learned and reinforced during an officer's early years on the force. Field training officers teach new recruits not just the technical aspects of policing, but also the unwritten rules about what they can get away with. When sexual misconduct is tolerated or ignored, it becomes normalized behavior that escalates over time. The Chicago case was far from unique. In Lincoln, Nebraska, a city with a much smaller police force, 8 police officers and 4 fire and rescue personnel filed lawsuits since 2016, alleging discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. The city paid more than $3.5 million to resolve 6 of these lawsuits, with at least 6 more pending in court. The sheer number of lawsuits from such a relatively small department raised red flags for national police practices experts, as one noted that many complaints with similar allegations from a department of that size was highly unusual and suggested systemic problems that went far beyond individual bad actors. Officer Sarah Williams became one of the most vocal critics of the Lincoln Police Department's culture after experiencing what she described as relentless harassment and discrimination. She was ultimately fired in December 2021 for allegedly mishandling evidence, but she fought back with a lawsuit, alleging that her termination was retaliation for speaking out about sexual harassment and discrimination within the department. In a heartbreaking address to the Lincoln City Council in 2021, Williams described the psychological toll of working in such a hostile environment. "There were days I didn't want to be alive," she told the assembled officials, her voice breaking with emotion. "So I quit. I quit because I didn't feel I had a choice. I feared for my safety. I didn't trust my co-workers." Williams's testimony provided a rare glimpse into the daily reality faced by female officers in departments where sexual misconduct and harassment are part of the culture. These women don't just have to worry about the dangers they face on the streets. They also have to navigate the threat posed by their own colleagues, the very people who should have their backs in dangerous situations. The pattern of multiple lawsuits and substantial financial settlements in Lincoln suggested that the problems ran deep within the department's leadership and culture. When that many officers are willing to risk their careers by filing lawsuits against their own employer, it indicates a level of desperation and abuse that goes far beyond normal workplace conflicts. But perhaps no case illustrates the intersection of police corruption and sexual violence more dramatically than the ongoing federal investigation into the Johnson City Police Department. This wasn't just about officers abusing their colleagues. It was about an entire department allegedly conspiring to protect a serial rapist in exchange for financial kickbacks. The investigation centers around allegations that Johnson City Police engaged in a corrupt scheme to shield businessman Sean Williams after multiple women accused him of sexual assault. What makes this case particularly horrifying is the scope of Williams's alleged crimes and the extent to which police allegedly went to protect him. Attorneys representing Williams's alleged victims turned over 520 pages of emails and attachments to federal investigators, documenting what they claim was a systematic effort by police to ignore, dismiss, and actively suppress reports of sexual assault. But the evidence went far beyond simple negligence or incompetence. When investigators finally searched Williams's downtown Johnson City condominium, they discovered electronic images showing him sexually assaulting 52 unconscious women. Among those images were women who had previously reported their assaults to the Johnson City Police Department, only to have their complaints dismissed or ignored. Even more disturbing, the collection included images of Williams sexually assaulting 2 children. The allegations suggest that some Johnson City officers were taking kickbacks from Williams in exchange for looking the other way when victims came forward. This wasn't just a failure of the system. It was the system actively working to enable and protect a predator who was documenting his crimes against dozens of victims. The corruption extended to intimidation tactics against victims who refused to stay silent. Police are accused of trying to frighten women who continue to speak out about their assaults, using their authority and resources to protect Williams rather than seeking justice for his victims. Former federal prosecutor Kateri Dahl filed a whistleblower lawsuit alleging that she was thwarted by Johnson City's police chief and other officers when she tried to investigate the rape allegations against Williams. Her lawsuit suggests that the corruption reached the highest levels of the department, with leadership actively working to obstruct justice and protect a serial predator. The Johnson City case represents one of the most extreme examples of how police corruption can facilitate sexual violence on a massive scale. When sexual assault reports, they bribes to ignore law enforcement officers are willing to take become active participants in those crimes, enabling predators to continue victimizing innocent people with impunity. These cases of systematic sexual misconduct and corruption within police departments reveal a disturbing truth about law enforcement culture in many agencies across the country. The badge that is supposed to represent protection and service has instead become a shield that protects predators and silences their victims. The impact extends far beyond the individual officers and victims involved. When police departments fail to address sexual misconduct within their own ranks, they lose the moral authority to investigate and prosecute sexual crimes in the community. How can citizens trust officers to take their reports of sexual assault seriously when those same officers are ignoring or covering up similar crimes committed by their colleagues? The financial cost of these failures is staggering, with taxpayers paying tens of millions of dollars in lawsuit settlements and judgments. But the human cost is immeasurable. Every woman who has been sexually assaulted by a police officer, every victim whose report was dismissed or covered up, every officer who has been retaliated against for speaking out represents a fundamental betrayal of the public trust. The pattern of sexual violence and corruption within law enforcement extends to cases that blur the line between official misconduct and outright criminal conspiracy. In one of the most disturbing examples of police sexual violence, undercover officers in British law enforcement infiltrated political protest movements and formed long-term intimate relationships with women under completely false identities. This wasn't a case of officers crossing professional boundaries or engaging in inappropriate conduct during the course of their duties. This was a systematic program of deception that turned intimate relationships into weapons of surveillance and control. The officers involved created entirely fictional personas, complete with fake names, backgrounds, and life stories, all designed to make their targets fall in love with people who didn't actually exist. 5 women who were victims of this elaborate deception came forward to expose one of the biggest scandals in British policing history. Each had believed herself to be in a serious, committed relationship with a man who shared her political beliefs and commitment to social justice. They had no idea that their partners were actually undercover police officers whose job was to spy on the movements they supported. The psychological trauma inflicted on these women cannot be overstated. They had shared their most intimate thoughts, feelings, and experiences with men they trusted completely, only to discover that everything about their relationships was a lie. Some had been involved with their fake partners for years, building lives and making plans together, never suspecting that they were actually targets of a police surveillance operation. The question of whether this constituted rape became a central issue in the legal proceedings that followed. When someone consents to sexual activity based on a fundamental deception about their partner's identity, can that consent be considered valid? The women involved certainly felt that they had been sexually violated in the most profound way possible, betrayed not just by individual officers, but by the entire system that had authorized and supported such tactics. The British undercover police scandal revealed how law enforcement agencies can weaponize intimate relationships, turning the most basic human need for connection and love into a tool of manipulation and control. It showed how the power and authority of the badge can be used to facilitate deception on the most personal level, causing lasting psychological harm to innocent people whose only crime was believing they could trust the person they loved. As more cases of police sexual violence and misconduct continue to emerge, a disturbing picture develops of law enforcement agencies that have lost their way, where the authority meant to protect has become a weapon used to harm and exploit. The badge that should represent justice and integrity has instead become a symbol of corruption and betrayal for too many victims. The systematic nature of these problems suggests that they cannot be solved by simply removing individual bad actors or implementing new training programs. They require a fundamental examination of police culture and accountability systems that have allowed such behavior to flourish for decades while victims suffered in silence. From the calculated murder committed by Stephanie Lazarus to the systematic sexual exploitation in departments across the country, these cases reveal how the thin blue line can become a wall of protection for the worst criminals in society. When those sworn to uphold the law become the ones breaking it, when those meant to protect become the predators, the very foundation of justice crumbles beneath the weight of their betrayal. The corruption and violence we've witnessed so far represents just the tip of an iceberg that runs much deeper than most people could ever imagine. What emerges from the shadows of these investigations is a pattern of behavior so systematic and protected that it challenges everything we thought we knew about those who carry the badge. In the quiet suburbs of Fort Worth, Texas, where tree-lined streets and modest homes suggested safety and stability, another female police officer was about to shatter that illusion in the most shocking way possible. Amber Geiger was a patrol officer with the Dallas Police Department, someone who had sworn an oath to protect and serve the citizens of her community. But on the evening of September 6, 2018, she would become the perpetrator of a crime so senseless and brutal that it would spark nationwide protests and forever change how America viewed police accountability. 26-year-old Botham Jean was living his best life. A native of the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, he had moved to Dallas to pursue his career as an accountant with PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was the kind of man who lit up every room he entered, known for his infectious smile, his love of singing in the church choir, and his genuine kindness toward everyone he met. Friends described him as someone who went out of his way to help others, whether it was mentoring younger colleagues at work or volunteering in his community. On that September evening, Botham was doing what millions of people do every day after work. He was relaxing in his own apartment, enjoying some ice cream while watching television. He was completely safe in his own home, behind locked doors, bothering absolutely no one. It should have been just another quiet Thursday night in his life. Instead, it would be his last. Amber'd just finished Geiger had a 15-hour shift and was returning to what she believed was her apartment in the South Side Flats complex. She was still in her police uniform, still carrying her service weapon, still operating under the authority and responsibility of her badge. But something was terribly wrong with her perception that night, something that would lead to an act of violence so shocking that it defied all logic and explanation. Geiger later claimed that she was exhausted from her long shift and confused about which floor she was on. She said she believed she was entering her own apartment when she put her key into what she thought was her door. When the key didn't work, she claimed the door was already slightly ajar, so she pushed it open and entered what she believed was her own home. What happened next was captured in the chilling 911 call that Geiger made immediately after the shooting. In the recording, her voice is filled with panic and confusion as she realizes the magnitude of what she has done. But by then, it was too late. Botham Jean lay dying on his own couch, shot twice in the chest by a police officer who claimed she thought he was an intruder in her apartment. The initial response from the Dallas Police Department and the district attorney's office was telling in its reluctance to treat this as what it obviously was, a homicide committed by one of their own officers. Geiger wasn't arrested immediately, despite having admittedly shot and killed an innocent man in his own home. Instead, she was allowed to remain free while investigators tried to piece together what had happened. The delay in arresting Geiger sparked immediate outrage in the Dallas community and beyond. Here was a police officer who had killed an innocent man in his own home, and she was being treated with a level of consideration and presumption of innocence that would never have been extended to a civilian who had done the same thing. The message was clear that the badge provided a level of protection that ordinary citizens could never expect. When the details of the case began to emerge, they painted a picture that was even more disturbing than the initial reports suggested. Geiger claimed she had entered what she thought was her apartment and seen a large silhouette that she perceived as a threat. Without identifying herself as a police officer, without issuing any commands or warnings, she drew her weapon and fired twice, striking Botham Jean in the chest and abdomen. The physical evidence at the scene contradicted key elements of Geiger's story. Her apartment was directly below Jean's, and the layout was identical, but there were obvious visual cues that should have alerted her to the fact that she was in the wrong place. Jean's apartment had different furniture, different decorations, and even a bright red doormat that was clearly visible outside his front door. More troubling was the discovery that Geiger and Jean had crossed paths before. They lived in the same apartment complex, and there had been previous complaints about noise coming from Jean's apartment. Some witnesses suggested that Geiger had been involved in those complaints, raising questions about whether this was truly a case of mistaken identity or something more sinister. The investigation revealed disturbing text messages from Geiger's phone that painted a picture of an officer with questionable judgment and potentially racist attitudes. Messages showed her making inappropriate jokes and comments that suggested a cavalier attitude toward violence and a lack of respect for the communities she was sworn to serve. When Geiger finally was arrested and charged, it was with manslaughter rather than murder, a decision that further inflamed community tensions. Critics argued that any ordinary citizen who had entered someone else's home and killed them would have been charged with murder immediately, regardless of their claimed confusion or exhaustion. The trial that followed became a lightning rod for discussions about police accountability, racial justice, and the value placed on Black lives in America. Prosecutors argued that Geiger's actions were not those of a confused, exhausted officer making an honest mistake, but rather those of someone who made a series of unreasonable decisions that led to the death of an innocent man. The defense painted Geiger as a dedicated officer who had made a tragic error in judgment after an exhausting shift. They argued that her actions, while resulting in an innocent man's death, were those of someone who genuinely believed she was defending herself in her own home against an intruder. But the evidence presented during the trial revealed a pattern of poor decision-making and questionable conduct that extended well beyond that September evening. Geiger's training records showed that she had been taught proper procedures for identifying threats and using deadly force, procedures that she completely ignored in her encounter with Botham Jean. The most powerful moments of the trial came when Jean's family took the stand to describe the impact of their loss. His mother spoke about the dreams that would never be fulfilled, the grandchildren she would never have, and the hole in their family that could never be filled. His younger brother described losing his role model and best friend, someone who had always been there to offer guidance and support. The testimony painted a picture of a man whose life had been cut short just as he was hitting his stride. Someone who had so much to offer the world, but would never get the chance because of a split-second decision by a police officer who couldn't be bothered to properly assess the situation before pulling the trigger. On October 1st, 2019, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of murder. Amber Geiger became one of the rare police officers to be convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting, a verdict that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. The sentencing phase of the trial provided one of the most extraordinary moments in recent courtroom history. Botham Jean's younger brother, Brant, made the stunning decision to forgive Geiger publicly and asked the judge if he could hug her. The image of this young black man embracing the white police officer who had killed his brother became one of the most powerful symbols of grace and forgiveness in modern American culture. But even as individual acts of forgiveness provided moments of healing, the broader implications of the Geiger case continue to reverberate through discussions about police reform and accountability. The fact that it took such overwhelming evidence and such sustained public pressure to secure a conviction raised troubling questions about how many other cases might have been swept under the rug. Geiger was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was far too lenient for taking an innocent life. The relatively light punishment seemed to confirm what critics had long argued, that the justice system treats police officers differently, even when they commit the most serious crimes. The Botham Jean case occurred against the backdrop of a national reckoning with police violence and accountability. It came just 2 years before the murder of George Floyd would spark worldwide protests and renewed calls for police reform. But even as these high-profile cases generated headlines and sparked conversations, a much darker pattern of police misconduct was continuing to unfold in departments across the country. In Louisville, Kentucky, another case involving police misconduct and cover-up was about to explode into national consciousness. The death of Briana Taylor would expose not just the dangers of no-knock warrants and militarized policing, but also the lengths to which police departments would go to protect officers who had made fatal mistakes. 26-year-old Briana Taylor was an emergency medical technician who had dedicated her life to helping others. She worked the overnight shift at 2 different hospitals, providing critical care to patients in their most vulnerable moments. She was studying to become a nurse, planning to expand her ability to serve her community and make a difference in people's lives. On the night of March 13, 2020, Briana was sleeping peacefully in her apartment alongside her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. They had spent a quiet evening together, watching a movie and talking about their future plans. Neither had any idea that their lives were about to be torn apart by a police raid based on false information and executed with shocking incompetence. The Louisville Metro Police Department had obtained a no-knock warrant for Briana's apartment as part of a drug investigation targeting her ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover. But the warrant was based on information that was not just outdated, but demonstrably false. Police claimed that Glover was receiving packages at Briana's address and that postal inspectors had confirmed suspicious deliveries. What investigators later discovered was that the postal inspector had never provided any such confirmation. In fact, postal authorities had specifically told police that there were no packages of interest being delivered to Briana's address. The warrant application was based on lies that would cost an innocent woman her life. The officers involved in obtaining the warrant, Detective Joshua Janes and Sergeant John Mattingly, knew or should have known that their affidavit contained false information. They were sworn law enforcement officers whose job was to present accurate, truthful information to judges when seeking warrants. Instead, they fabricated evidence and omitted crucial facts in order to justify a raid on an apartment where they had no legitimate reason to believe criminal activity was occurring. When the raid team arrived at Briana's apartment in the early morning hours, they claimed to have knocked and announced themselves as police officers. But neighbors and Kenneth Walker testified that they heard loud banging on the door, but no clear identification of who was outside. In the darkness and confusion, Walker believed that someone was trying to break into their home. Kentucky is a stand-your-ground state, and Walker was legally carrying a licensed firearm. When the door was breached and armed figures burst into the apartment, he fired one shot, striking Sergeant Mattingly in the leg. It was exactly the kind of defensive action that Kentucky law specifically protects, a homeowner defending himself and his girlfriend from what appeared to be a home invasion. The police response was swift and overwhelming. Officers fired 32 shots into the apartment, with bullets flying through walls and into neighboring units where innocent families were sleeping. 6 of those bullets struck Briana Taylor, killing her as she stood in the hallway of her own home. The aftermath of the shooting revealed a pattern of misconduct and cover-up that extended throughout the Louisville Metro Police Department and beyond. The initial incident report was so incomplete and inaccurate that it listed Briana's injuries as none, despite the fact that she had been shot 6 times and was dead at the scene. Detective Brett Hankerson, one of the officers who fired into the apartment, was terminated for his actions that night. The department found that he had wantonly and blindly fired 10 shots through a covered patio door and window, displaying an extreme indifference to the value of human life when he couldn't see what he was shooting at. But the cover-up went much deeper than one rogue detective's reckless shooting. The entire chain of command was involved in protecting the officers and minimizing the department's liability. Body camera footage that should have documented the raid was mysteriously missing or corrupted. Officers' statements about the incident contained numerous inconsistencies and contradictions. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that Detective Janes had not just made mistakes in his warrant application, he had deliberately lied. Federal investigators later charged him with civil rights violations, alleging that he had knowingly provided false information to obtain the warrant that led to Briana's death. The case became a national symbol of police misconduct and racial injustice, sparking months of protests in Louisville and around the world. Demonstrators demanded that the officers involved be charged with murder, arguing that Briana's death was the inevitable result of a reckless raid based on false information. But when Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron announced the results of the grand jury investigation, only one officer was indicted, and not for Briana's death. Detective Hankerson was charged with wanton endangerment for firing shots that went into neighboring apartments, but no one was held criminally responsible for killing an innocent woman in her own home. The decision sparked renewed outrage and raised serious questions about the grand jury process. Audio recordings of the proceedings, released months later, revealed that Cameron's office had never even asked the grand jury to consider murder charges against the officers who killed Briana, despite public statements suggesting that all options had been considered. The federal charges that were eventually filed against Janes and other officers provided some measure of accountability, but they also highlighted how local authorities had failed to hold their own people responsible for a death that resulted from clear misconduct and deception. The Briana Taylor case exposed how the combination of militarized policing tactics, false warrant applications, and institutional cover-ups could turn innocent citizens into casualties of a law enforcement system that had lost its way. It showed how officers could lie to judges, kill innocent people, and then rely on their departments and prosecutors to protect them from consequences. As shocking as these individual cases were, they represented just a fraction of a much larger problem that was metastasizing throughout law enforcement agencies across the country. The pattern of misconduct, violence, and cover-up was becoming so pervasive that it threatened to undermine the entire concept of police legitimacy and public trust. In Johnson City, Tennessee, federal investigators were uncovering evidence of corruption so extensive and disturbing that it challenged everything people thought they knew about police protection and service. The case involved not just individual officers taking bribes, but an entire department allegedly conspiring to protect a serial predator who was documenting his crimes against dozens of victims. The investigation centered on businessman Sean Williams, who had been accused of sexual assault by multiple women over several years. But instead of investigating these complaints thoroughly and seeking justice for the victims, Johnson City police officers allegedly worked to shield Williams from prosecution in exchange for financial kickbacks and other benefits. The scope of Williams's alleged crimes was staggering. When investigators finally searched his downtown condominium, they found electronic evidence showing him sexually assaulting 52 unconscious women. The images were not just evidence of serial rape, they were trophies that Williams had collected to document his crimes against victims who were unable to consent or defend themselves. What made the case even more horrifying was the discovery that some of the women in Williams's collection had previously reported their assaults to the Johnson City Police Department. They had trusted the system to investigate their complaints and seek justice, only to have their reports dismissed or buried by officers who were allegedly being paid to look the other way. From the calculated murder committed by Stephanie Lazarus to the systematic corruption protecting serial predators, these cases reveal a terrifying truth about law enforcement in America. When those sworn to protect and serve become the very monsters they're meant to stop, when the badge becomes a shield for the worst criminals in society, the entire foundation of justice crumbles. The stories we've explored today represent more than isolated incidents of misconduct. They expose a culture within many police departments where violence, sexual exploitation, and cover-ups are not aberrations, but accepted practices protected by codes of silence and institutional indifference. From the DNA evidence that finally caught a killer cop after 23 years, to the federal investigations uncovering departments that actively protected sexual predators, these cases demonstrate how power, without accountability, inevitably corrupts. The financial cost of these failures runs into hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars in settlements and judgments. But the human cost is immeasurable. Every victim who suffered in silence, every officer who was retaliated against for speaking out, every family destroyed by police violence represents a fundamental betrayal of the public trust that may take generations to repair. As these investigations continue to unfold across the country, one thing becomes crystal clear. The thin blue line has become a wall of protection for some of the most dangerous criminals in our society. Until we demand real accountability and systematic reform, the badge will continue to be a weapon wielded by those who have forgotten that their first duty is to protect and serve, not to prey upon the innocent.